Hello everyone, welcome back to another monthly AAIB Bulletin Debrief. Thanks for the feedback on the last video. I promised no music in the future. There are two incidents to discuss following publication of this month's bulletin, one commercial and one from general aviation. The first incident to discuss this month involves a TUI Boeing 787 registration Golf Tango Uniform India Bravo returning to Manchester from Cancun in Mexico on the 21st of December 2023. Tomjet 173 had crossed the Atlantic overnight and was scheduled to arrive at 7:35 a.m. The forecast for Manchester wasn't great, broken clouds at 900 feet, clearing between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m, but westerly winds of 25 knots gusting to 42 knots. However, the crew mistakenly believed that both cloud and wind would dissipate after 6 a.m. East Midlands was their nominated alternative destination, and the forecast there wasn't great either, with westerly winds at 20 knots gusting to 30 knots and broken clouds at 1,200 feet. Because the crew thought the weather would have improved by the time they were landing, they only elected to carry an additional 984 kilos of fuel, which would only have given them an additional 15 minutes of flight time. The orientation of runways at the two airports is such that if you had the same winds at both, the crosswind components and therefore how challenging the approach and landing might be would be different between East Midlands and Manchester. The runway at East Midlands runs east to west, with runway 27 having a magnetic heading of 268 degrees, whereas the runways at Manchester 23 right and 23 left have the same magnetic orientation of 231 degrees. If we take the winds on the day, the crosswind component at Manchester would have been expected to be 19 knots gusting to 31 knots, whereas at East Midlands it would have only been 5 knots gusting to 8 knots, which would of course made for a much less challenging approach. The flight plan also accounted for Birmingham being a suitable alternative. Birmingham's single runway is orientated northwest to southeast and is numbered 33 and 15. Taking runway 33, the magnetic heading is 326 degrees, which would have meant a crosswind component here of 13 knots gusting to 21 knots. At 7:18 a.m, the aircraft contacted Manchester radar and was instructed to hold at waypoint Mercy, and that there were 7 aircraft ahead of them in the hold. This video from Plane Spotting Ringway on YouTube taken on the day gives a good idea of the conditions. There were multiple go-arounds, and as you can see, the approach was far from smooth. An aircraft which had made a go-around reported to the approach controller that they had encountered wind shear on approach and that they may need to divert to Birmingham. At 07:28, the pilot monitoring on Tomjet 173 called East Midlands radar, advising that they may need to divert. 3 minutes later, East Midlands responded advising them that they would not be able to accept their size of aircraft. So next, the pilot monitoring tried Birmingham, who accepted, and the aircraft had at that time been in the hull for about 20 minutes and had 4,100 kilos of fuel remaining. The minimum required for a diversion to Birmingham was 3,366 kilos. During the transit to Birmingham, the insufficient fuel warning appeared on the ICAS screen. The crew executed the checklist and discussed the consequences of the low fuel situation during the approach briefing. The winds at Birmingham were 290 at 25 knots gusting to 39, with scattered clouds at 2,800 feet. The controller vectored the aircraft for the ILS approach to runway 33. The winds would have given a crosswind component of 15 knots gusting to 22 knots. On final approach to the runway at 240 feet, the aircraft ground proximity warning system announced wind shear, and the crew initiated a go-around as per the standard procedures. There was 2,700 kilos of fuel remaining at this stage. During the climb-out, the crew declared a mayday due to minimum fuel, and the controller set them up for another approach. Frequencies were changed from Birmingham radar to Birmingham director. Birmingham director was an additional control position which had been opened on the day due to the complexity of traffic due to the multiple diversions because of the bad weather. They were sat next to the Birmingham approach controller in the tower, and Birmingham director was aware of a low fuel emergency on board Tomjet 173. Despite this, the director sequenced a different aircraft to land before Tomjet 173, which meant it had to fly an extended track to get back onto the approach. The second approach and landing were successful, and the aircraft landed with 1,250 kilos of fuel on board, which was below the final reserve volume of 1,911 kilos. The final reserve volume is that required to fly for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet at the destination in international standard atmosphere conditions. This is important as, say, for instance, there was an incident that closed a runway at Birmingham, then they would have had to go elsewhere. So what were the issues at play here? We've discussed the wind and how the conditions were similar across the country. However, East Midlands offered the most favourable conditions because of the orientation of its runway. But what was happening at East Midlands Airport, which regularly handles large cargo aircraft such as the 767 and 777, as well as the occasional 747, for it to say no to Tomjet 173? East Midlands carried out an investigation and found that the Airfield Operations Unit had stated that they could only accept 2 737-800 or similar sized aircraft, and that anything else would depend on the ground handler's capacity at the time. The controller passed on the message to Tomjet 173 that they couldn't accept them, as we know. There was then a subsequent conversation 5 minutes later between the air traffic control assistant and the airport control room, who actually stated they would accept a Boeing 787. This was passed on to the controller, who tried to raise Tomjet 173, but they'd already left the frequency. East Midlands Airport has re-emphasised to their staff that any decisions about the type and number of aircraft that could be accepted should be made by the central control room and not the Airfield Operations Unit. The consequence of East Midlands refusing the diversion meant that Tomjet 173 made an approach to an airport with significant crosswind and the possibility of wind shear on final approach. Additionally, the aircraft left Cancun with only 15 minutes of additional fuel, though there was capacity for significantly more. The reporting bulletin doesn't really go into this in much more detail. Why were the crew confused about the weather report when conditions were always forecast to be pretty bleak and there would have been a high risk of extended holding and/or diversion? The second serious incident in this month's bulletin involves a Sakata TB20 Trinidad, registration November 33 November Whiskey, which was taking off from Langham Airfield in Norfolk, not to be confused with Langham Airfield near Oakham, on the 10th of October 2023. The pilot and the 2 passengers suffered serious injuries. The aircraft and its occupants had flown from Nottingham to Langham earlier in the day. The pilot had not flown to Langham before, but had visited 2 weeks previously and sought advice from other pilots and the airfield owner as part of his flight planning. There was a crosswind on the final approach, requiring the pilot to crab the aircraft, and after touchdown the pilot felt the aircraft suddenly drag to the left during braking. During the subsequent taxi, the pilot tested the aircraft's brakes and controls, found nothing wrong, and could see no damage to the runway surface which could have contributed. On embarking on the return flight, the weather was clear skies with a wind from 230 degrees at 12 knots. The takeoff roll commenced from the threshold of runway 28 and the pilot recalled reaching 73 knots before the aircraft became airborne without any pitch input. Shortly afterwards, witnesses reported the aircraft appeared to suddenly crab to the left and then tip to the left. The passengers felt a shunt to the left as if the aircraft had hit something or encountered a gust of wind. The pilot applied corrective inputs, but as the aircraft became level with the top of the trees alongside the runway edge, the left wingtip dropped and struck several of the trees. The aircraft descended quickly and came to a rest on its left side. Witnesses assisted the passengers to escape through the broken windscreen, and the right-hand door was forced open to allow the pilot to exit. The aircraft was examined post-accident and damage to the tail was noted consistent with a tail strike. The pilot confirmed that this wasn't present prior to the accident flight. The flaps were in the appropriate takeoff setting of 10 degrees, but the rudder trim rotary switch was not set to the correct position. The TB20 rudder trim control has a takeoff and a cruise position, and the trim was set halfway between the two. Because of the damage to the aircraft, it wasn't possible to determine whether this might have moved due to the accident or if it was just set incorrectly at the time of takeoff. So what about the airfield? Langham is an unlicensed aerodrome located on the southern periphery of the former RAF Langham. Runway 28 is 700 metres long, 15 metres wide, and is part of the airfield's old perimeter track. The surface is varied with some potholes and cracking damage along its length. The alignment is nearly perpendicular to the winds at the time of the accident. The Pooley's plate for Langham shows trees along the southern edge of the runway 10 and 28 and notes that the airfield is not suitable for inexperienced pilots due to the obstructions. The pilot of the aircraft in this incident had 121 hours of experience, but only 10 in the preceding 12 months. There is a document produced by the Civil Aviation Authority outlining recommendations for both the operation of unlicensed airfields and the flights in and out of them for pilots, called CAP 793. It recommends a minimum runway width for aircraft such as November 33 November Whiskey to be 18 metres, and remember the runway at Langham is only 15 metres wide. The document also states that there should be no vertical obstacles within 25 metres of either side of the centreline, and any runway end obstacle should not be above 2 metres high. As you can see from this image at Langham, there are trees 9 metres high only 10.5 metres from the centreline, and trees at the runway 28 threshold more than 20 metres tall. This isn't the first time CAP 793 has been referenced in an accident report. In this channel's first video, it came into play during a fatal accident where the investigation found a mound within the recommended clear area had contributed to the resulting impact and death of the pilot. In that case, the airfield operator removed the mound. So let's summarise all the factors at play here. Firstly, the airfield is described as unsuitable for inexperienced pilots due to the obstructions at the runway 28 threshold, but also the high trees in the close proximity to the runway centreline. Having said that, the pilot in this accident had performed a successful approach and landing earlier in the day. It's hard to define what experience means in this context, and the AAIB haven't attempted to do that as part of this investigation. Secondly, it's likely that there was a tail strike at some point during the takeoff roll, as the damage to the tail wasn't present before takeoff. Remember too that the occupants felt a thud. According to the report, the pilot disagrees with that analysis, but I don't see any other explanation for the damage to the tail unless he was mistaken in his pre-flight checks. This likely led to an unstable climb-out requiring harsh control inputs to counter. Then, the trees. The wind was blowing from the southwest, and the trees would have sheltered the runway somewhat from this. However, as the aircraft gained height, the wind would have become more of a factor. In fact, there would have been a high likelihood of turbulent air at the tree line given the direction of the wind. Thirdly, although due to crash damage this couldn't be confirmed, it appears at least from the position of the rudder trim tab that it wasn't set in the correct position for takeoff, which would have resulted in adverse yaw and drift towards the trees on the left, which were so close to the runway there was limited margin for any unexpected deviation from an uneventful takeoff run. Add all these things together, and it's easy to see why the climb out might have easily become unstable, leading to the accident. Moving on to a quick-fire discussion of the multiple record-only investigations in this month's bulletin. These are usually minor incidents not causing injury which are reported to the AAIB by pilots but don't warrant a further investigation. This month there's 10. Let's go. Number 1. In September 2023, a thruster T600N near Wellesbourne in Warwickshire was descending to land when the engine sputtered and stopped. The pilot carried out a successful forced landing in a field near the airfield. The carburettor had literally come detached from the engine. Number 2. In April 2024, a Beech B60 Duke on approach to Ronaldsway on the Isle of Man observed a no gear down indication. The pilot performed a low approach and go around with ATC confirming no gear was down. The pilot was concerned he was running low on fuel, so rather than troubleshoot further, he made a gear up landing on a grassy area towards the north of the runway. Number 3. July 2024, a DHC-1 Chipmunk at Hamilton Airfield in Kent took off, after which the engine power reduced to 0. The pilot landed back on the runway but was unable to stop before reaching a livestock fence at the end. The aircraft was substantially damaged, but the pilot and passenger were well. Number 4. Again in July 2024, a Piper PA-38 at Newhall Mains Airfield touched down late and the pilot immediately braked. The pilot was recently qualified but familiar with the airfield and was aware of a bank at the end of the runway, so applied power and pulled up to clear the bank. The aircraft stalled and came to rest in a field. Number 5. A CASA 1113 E Series 2000 near Syerston in August 2024. The engine stopped mid-flight and would not respond to any throttle inputs. The pilot made a forced landing in a field containing crops and the aircraft nosed over. Number 6, in September 2024, a Cessna 152 near Buntingford, a student pilot initiated a climb and the engine began to run rough. The instructor took over, but the engine continued to provide insufficient power and a forced landing was made in a field with the aircraft flipping onto its back. Number 7, same month, Marquardt MA5 near Goodwood in Sussex. The push rod controlling the upper right ailerons had become detached from them in flight and was dragging behind the aircraft, which the pilot noticed. Control was maintained, but he immediately returned for a landing at Goodwood. A crack was subsequently found, which was the cause of a failure. Number 8, nearly there, in November 2024, an Icarus C-42 FB-80 was landing at Solent Airport with a crosswind component of 15 knots, the limit for the aircraft being 16, and the pilot also reported it was quite gusty. The aircraft drifted to the left on landing, striking a runway edge light, which caused the nose gear to collapse and the aircraft came to a rest at the side of the runway. Number 9, December 2024, a Pegasus Quick at Balado Airfield. The aircraft bounced on landing, causing the pilot to increase power. However, there was not enough lift to go around. The aircraft stalled, landing heavily, and caused the nose wheel to collapse. Finally, number 10, also in December 2024, a Gimbal Cabri G2 at Bicester Aerodrome landed hard, bounced again, and then landed, damaging both skids. So that wraps up another monthly AAIB Bulletin Debrief from Final Descent UK. I hope you enjoy the video. Remember to like, subscribe and share. Thanks for watching. See you next time.